Nigeria, the US has put boots on the ground in the African country, which has been grappling with Islamic State terror attacks. And now, to counter the menace, the US has deployed a small military team to Nigeria. The move was announced.
This decision wasn't finalized in Abuja. It wasn't even signed in Washington. It was approved in Rome. That's when the story stops being about militants and starts being about power, because moves this quiet only happen when something has already broken somewhere else. Something big. Something that can't be fixed in the open. Nigeria didn't suddenly become important. It was chosen, not as a battlefield, but as a replacement. And the question now isn't who entered Nigeria. It's what collapsed that made them come. Let's find out. It didn't happen with an explosion. There was no warning, no breaking news banner. Just a quiet order from a new military government in Niger. All US forces must leave. Within weeks, the base was emptied, hangars closed, radar screens went black. Drones that once crossed the Sahel every night vanished from the sky. To most people, it looked like a routine political shift. Another African country is kicking out foreign troops. Another headline swallowed by the news cycle. But inside military command rooms, panic followed. Because that base in Niger was not a single outpost. It was the center of gravity for everything the United States ran across West Africa. From there, surveillance flights watched Mali, Burkina Faso, northern Nigeria, Chad, and Libya's southern corridors. Intelligence was collected, filtered, shared, and turned into targets. Every regional operation passed through that hub. When Niger shut it down, the system didn't just lose a location, it lost its eyes, timing, and coordination. For the first time in years, Washington could no longer see the battlefield in real time. Strike approvals slowed, drone corridors collapsed, intelligence feeds stopped synchronizing. Regional partners felt the gap immediately. Militants moved faster, borders blurred, routes reopened, and the silence was the loudest signal of all. Inside AFRICOM, this wasn't treated as a setback. It was treated as a structural failure, because their entire West African strategy had been built around one assumption, that Niger would remain the anchor. That assumption was now dead. For months, nothing replaced it. No new base was announced. No alternative hub was revealed. But something strange began to happen. Flight routes changed. Long-range surveillance aircraft started looping in unfamiliar patterns over the Atlantic before turning inland. Refueling tankers adjusted their schedules. Satellite bandwidth that once pointed toward Niger quietly shifted west. It looked random until analysts began noticing a new convergence point: Nigeria. But this shift wasn't announced. It wasn't debated. It was executed in fragments, through airspace permissions, temporary training missions, logistics agreements, and short-term cooperation clauses. No single move meant much on its own. Together, they meant everything. Because the United States didn't rebuild the lost base. It dissolved it into Nigeria's systems. That is why nothing visible changed at first. No walls, no flags, no occupation, just invisible threads being rewired through an existing state. And that made the move far more permanent than any base ever could be. Nigeria wasn't reacting to a crisis. It was being prepared for a role created by a collapse far away, signed quietly elsewhere, and executed before anyone understood what was happening. The Sahel had lost its command spine, and something new was being grown inside Nigeria to replace it. So the real mystery is not why the US came. It is why the decision had to be invisible. Because systems only move in the dark when the change is too big to explain. So, who authorized Nigeria to become the new control point for a region that just lost its center? The authorization didn't come from Nigerians debating their future. It came from a room far from Abuja, far from cameras, far from parliament. It came from Rome. That's where US Africa Command officials met President Bola Tinubu, not in a crisis summit, not in an emergency setting, just talks. Quiet, procedural, almost boring on paper. But those meetings produced a decision with consequences far bigger than anything later announced to the public. Because after Rome, things changed fast. Within days, Nigeria approved U.S. airstrikes on its own territory. Not joint patrols, not intelligence sharing, actual strikes. Then, just as quietly, permission was given for a U.S. team to be placed inside the country. Not visiting, not rotating, installed. No national address followed. No explanation of limits. No timeline for exit. And that silence wasn't accidental. Rome matters because that city isn't symbolic. It's functional. It's where NATO logistics planning overlaps with AFRICOM coordination. It's where regional force architecture is discussed away from domestic politics. Decisions made there aren't about today's headlines. They're about long-term positioning. That's why the deal couldn't happen in Abuja. In Nigeria, questions would have been asked. Who controls what? Who authorizes strikes? Who decides targets? In Rome, those questions don't exist. Only execution does. And execution required something very specific. A country large enough to absorb foreign operational systems without visibly changing shape. Nigeria fit perfectly. It already had air bases. It already had intelligence services. It already had ongoing security operations that could mask new layers being added underneath. No new base needed to be built. No announcement needed to be made. The US didn't enter Nigeria as an occupier. It entered as an upgrade. From the outside, it still looked like Nigeria's war. Nigerian troops, Nigerian uniforms, Nigerian statements, but behind the scenes, new access permissions were signed. New airspace corridors opened. New coordination channels activated. This is why the move didn't feel sudden on the ground. It felt gradual, almost invisible. Each step looked small, reasonable, temporary. That's how permanent systems are installed. Nigeria didn't join a US mission. It absorbed a US mission architecture. And once that architecture exists inside a state, it doesn't need permission every time it acts. It only needs compatibility, alignment, cooperation. That's what Rome secured. Not soldiers, not weapons. Access. But access to what exactly? Because the small team everyone keeps mentioning isn't there to patrol villages or chase militants through forests. Its role is far quieter and far more powerful. So the next question isn't why Nigeria agreed. It's this. What did the United States actually place inside Nigeria once the door was opened? What the United States placed inside Nigeria was not a fighting force. No battalions were arriving at airports. No armored vehicles rolling through cities. No foreign patrols on Nigerian streets. That's why most people missed it. They were looking for soldiers. What moved in instead were decision tools. Quietly, methodically, the US installed the kind of systems that don't make noise but change outcomes. Intelligence fusion desks, secure satellite uplinks, encrypted data pipelines that pull information from drones, signals, aircraft, and ground sources into a single picture. The kind of picture that tells you where, when, and who, before anyone on the ground even feels movement. This is what the small team exists to operate. They don't kick down doors. They don't chase fighters. They connect dots and decide which dots matter. Once those systems are active, something subtle but irreversible happens. Nigeria stops being just a country fighting its own insurgency. It becomes a launch environment, a place where operations are planned, routed, approved, and coordinated, not just for Nigeria, but for the wider region. That's the real shift. Because whoever controls intelligence flow controls the war before the first shot is fired. They decide which group is labeled urgent, which threat can wait, which area gets watched, and which doesn't. They decide when pressure increases and when it eases. They decide what success looks like. And those decisions no longer happen entirely inside Nigeria. They happen across secure links that lead outward. This is why no one wants to describe the team's capabilities. Saying it plainly would force an uncomfortable admission that operational authority has been shared, not temporarily, but structurally. Once intelligence, surveillance, and strike coordination are integrated into foreign systems, pulling them out becomes nearly impossible without collapsing the entire operation. That's not theory. That's how modern warfare works. You don't need to own the battlefield anymore. You just need to own the interface. And Nigeria became that interface. This also explains why there was no timeline attached to the deployment. You can rotate troops, you can close a base, but systems embedded inside another military's workflow don't leave cleanly. They become part of daily operations. Officers rely on them. Commanders plan around them. Decisions adapt to their presence. At that point, removal doesn't look like independence. It looks like self-sabotage. That's the leverage. And leverage always attracts more than just governments. Once these systems are live, they need constant support. Maintenance, software updates, analysis, logistics. Contractors step in. Private firms, data specialists, drone technicians, people who don't answer to Nigerian voters or Nigerian courts, but whose work quietly shapes the battlefield. The war stops being a national effort. It becomes a networked operation. And networks don't shrink on their own. They expand. They look for justification. They look for continuity. They look for permanence. Which raises the next problem. One Nigeria doesn't control once the switch is flipped. Because if war is now managed through systems designed to stay online, what incentive exists to ever turn them off? And when a conflict becomes something that must be maintained, not resolved, who benefits from that reality? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. The answer is uncomfortable, which is why it's rarely said out loud. When a conflict shifts from being fought to being managed, the biggest winners are not governments or civilians. They are the systems and industries that exist only as long as instability continues. Once Nigeria became a networked operation, plugged into foreign intelligence flows, surveillance grids, and strike coordination systems, a second layer automatically followed. Not troops, not diplomats, businesses. Every modern security architecture needs constant servicing. Drones don't maintain themselves. Surveillance platforms require analysts around the clock. Data pipelines need software updates, encryption upgrades, and hardware replacements. None of this is handled by soldiers alone. It's handled by private firms with long-term contracts. This is where the logic of the war quietly changes. Ending a conflict becomes disruptive. Reducing operations becomes inefficient. Stability becomes less important than continuity, because continuity keeps contracts alive. That's why these systems are designed without exit points. No clear mission accomplished. No final objective. Just an ongoing requirement to monitor, assess, adjust, and respond. The language shifts from victory to containment, from resolution to degradation, from peace to manageable threat levels. Nigeria doesn't disappear into this model overnight. It slides in gradually. First, operations intensify in one region. Then pressure pushes militants into neighboring areas. Those areas are suddenly declared new hotspots. New resources are deployed. New justifications are written. The map expands. What looks like progress on paper is often just movement, violence relocating rather than ending. And relocation is useful. It creates fresh urgency, fresh funding requests, fresh operational reasons to stay. This is how a security mission turns into a self-sustaining ecosystem, and Nigeria's size makes it especially valuable. Its borders touch multiple fragile regions. Any shift inside Nigeria ripples outward. That ripple becomes evidence. Evidence becomes justification. Justification becomes permanence. But here's the critical part. Once a country is integrated into this kind of system, it no longer controls the tempo of the conflict. Escalation and de-escalation respond to regional calculations, not local realities. Threat levels are measured through dashboards, not lived experience. Decisions are optimized for system stability, not societal healing. This is why these wars never end cleanly. Peace is messy, peace is unpredictable, peace breaks business models, and Nigeria didn't sign up to host a business, it signed up to fight insecurity. But the moment conflict becomes something that sustains infrastructure, supports industries, and justifies permanent presence, the original goal quietly dissolves. Which leads to the most dangerous realization yet. There is already a country where this exact model has been running for decades, a place where foreign operations never leave, Threats are never eliminated, and instability is endlessly managed. That country wasn't chosen by accident. So before Nigeria convinces itself that this path leads to safety, it needs to look carefully at the place that walked it first. What happens when a country becomes the prototype for permanent war and never escapes it? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. The answer is Somalia. For more than 2 decades, Somalia has existed inside the exact model now being introduced to Nigeria. Not occupation, not peacekeeping, but permanent counterinsurgency management. No clear start date, no clear end date. Just an endless series of operations described as progress. Every few months, statements sound familiar. Militants degraded, leadership neutralized, territory denied. Yet the war never concludes. Somalia is not treated as a place meant to recover. It is treated as a space meant to be kept under watch. Surveillance never shuts down. Airstrikes never stop completely. Intelligence sharing never winds down. The threat is always described as contained, never eliminated, because elimination would require something the system avoids: disengagement. That's the quiet lesson. Once a country becomes the host for foreign security architecture, the conflict becomes structural, not situational. Even when violence drops, the presence remains. Even when one group weakens, another is elevated. The mission adapts to survive itself. Somalia shows what happens when the definition of success is rewritten. Success no longer means stability or sovereignty. It means the system continues to function smoothly. Data flows uninterrupted. Aircraft remain operational. Partnerships stay active. The war becomes background noise, constant, expected, normalized, and the country hosting it loses something subtle but crucial: the ability to imagine an end. That's the danger Nigeria is now approaching. Not invasion, not occupation, but entrenchment. Because once a foreign security system embeds deeply enough, it doesn't leave when conditions improve. It leaves only when forced, and by then, forcing it becomes politically and operationally costly. Local forces become dependent. Command chains adjust. Strategy is written around external support. At that point, sovereignty becomes theoretical. Somalia's leaders change. Governments rise and fall. But the architecture stays, always justified by the same argument. Leaving would create a vacuum, and no one wants to be blamed for a vacuum. So the presence continues. Nigeria is not Somalia. It is larger, richer, and more complex. But that doesn't make it immune. It makes it more valuable. A bigger platform, a wider reach, a stronger justification for regional operations. And this is where the story sharpens. Because Somalia was framed as a fragile state needing help. Nigeria is framed as a partner. That makes the model even harder to challenge. When help is framed as cooperation, questioning it sounds irresponsible, dangerous, even disloyal. That's how permanence hides in plain sight. Somalia wasn't trapped overnight. It was stabilized into dependency, one operation at a time. Nigeria is now standing at that same doorway. Not being pushed, not being forced, but being invited. So the real issue is no longer what the United States intends. It's whether Nigeria still controls the moment when temporary becomes permanent. Because once that moment passes, the story stops being about fighting insecurity and starts being about living inside it. So what changed in 2026 that allowed this model to spread from fragile states to Africa's most powerful one? What changed in 2026 was not the threat. It was the method. For years, this model was reserved for countries labeled fragile, failing, or broken. Places where foreign involvement could be justified as an emergency intervention. Somalia fit that label. So did others. Nigeria never did. Until now. In 2026, the United States crossed a quiet threshold. It stopped needing weakness to justify its presence. Instead of building bases in unstable states, it began embedding systems inside strong ones. No occupation, no takeover, just integration. That's the shift. Nigeria wasn't chosen because it was collapsing. It was chosen because it was functional. Functional institutions can carry foreign systems without appearing occupied. Functional militaries can absorb external command layers without public breakdown. Functional governments can sell integration as cooperation. This is why the move feels different. In Somalia, foreign forces fill a vacuum. In Nigeria, they reshape the flow of decisions. The battlefield is no longer the forest or the desert, it's the process. Who receives intelligence first? Who sets threat priorities? Who authorizes escalation? Who defines success? Once those choices are shared, sovereignty isn't lost dramatically. It thins, quietly, professionally, through meetings, dashboards, protocols, and coordination cells. This is the new phase. Foreign power no longer needs territory. It needs interfaces, and Nigeria has now become one. That doesn't mean Nigeria has surrendered control. It means control is now negotiated daily, not owned outright. It means future decisions will always be made with an external system in mind. It means disengagement will no longer be a switch. It will be a disruption. That's why these arrangements are so hard to reverse. Removing troops is political. Removing systems is operational chaos. Once commanders rely on shared intelligence, once planning cycles adapt to external inputs, once regional operations are coordinated through foreign-linked networks, independence becomes expensive, not impossible, but costly. And cost is how permanence defends itself. This is the part most people miss. The danger isn't that Nigeria becomes a puppet. The danger is that it becomes indispensable to someone else's strategy. Once that happens, Nigeria's security priorities stop being purely Nigerian. They become regional tools in a larger architecture. That architecture doesn't ask permission every time it expands. It grows where access already exists. Which means Nigeria's future role isn't limited to its own borders. It's now tied to instability across West Africa, whether Nigeria wants that responsibility or not. And that brings the story to its sharpest point. This was never about militants. It was never about emergency help. It was about where power goes when it loses a base, but refuses to lose influence. In 2026, that power moved inward, not outward. Into systems, into processes, into Nigeria. So the final question isn't whether this will improve security in the short term. The real question is far harder and far more important. When the day comes that Nigeria wants this system gone, will it still be able to say no? Let us know in the comment section. Was it the US's plan all along? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.